Emperor Kaltorius Rey ascended to the obsidian throne of the Vorthane Empire on the strength of a prophecy his own grandmother had commissioned from the Empire's most celebrated oracle circle 3 decades before his birth. A prophecy that named him, in language his tutors had drilled into his understanding from earliest childhood, as the sovereign destined to complete the Vorthane ascendance, the final, total unification of the known galaxy beneath a single throne. An ambition the Empire's ruling dynasty had pursued with varying degrees of success for over 6 centuries. He took the throne at 31, following his father's sudden death, with an absolute, unshakable confidence in his own destiny that his closest advisors would spend the following 2 decades trying, with steadily diminishing success, to temper with something resembling caution. It was not, in the Empire's long history, an unusual trait among its emperors. The Vorthane dynasty had built its 6 centuries of expansion on precisely this kind of confidence, a civilizational certainty that the galaxy's other species existed, in the final accounting, either to be absorbed into the Empire's glory or swept aside by it. And Kaltorius Rey had inherited that certainty as thoroughly as he had inherited the throne itself. What distinguished his particular reign, in the judgment of the historians who would eventually chronicle its catastrophic final chapter, was not the confidence itself, but the specific, repeated pattern of warnings he received across 2 decades regarding a single species his own intelligence services flagged, with mounting urgency, as fundamentally different from every other power the Empire had ever absorbed or conquered, and the equally specific, repeated pattern of his refusal to hear any of them. The first warning arrived in the 4th year of his reign, delivered by a trade envoy named Cassia Vorn, who had spent 18 months establishing the Empire's initial commercial contact with a species called Terrans, occupying a modest, newly spacefaring world the Empire's Outer Survey Division had catalogued as a promising future acquisition, rich in resources, and by every early physiological assessment, entirely unremarkable in its capacity for resistance. "Your Majesty," Cassia Vorn said, presenting her formal report to the Emperor's court in a session that would, unbeknownst to anyone present, establish the pattern that defined the following 2 decades. "I would recommend this Empire proceed with considerably more caution toward Terran space than our initial survey assessment suggested was necessary. Their trade delegations negotiate with a discipline and a long-term strategic patience I have not encountered among any newly contacted species in my entire career. They concede nothing they have not deliberately chosen to concede, and I have twice now caught our own negotiators conceding points they believed insignificant, only to discover, months later, that the Terran delegation had extracted from those concessions considerably more strategic value than our own analysis anticipated at the time." Kaltorius Rey, seated on a throne he had occupied for barely 4 years and was still, in the private assessment of several of his own senior ministers, working to fully grow into, received this report with the particular impatience of a young ruler eager to see his reign's early ambitions validated rather than complicated. "You describe careful negotiators," he said, "and ask this court to treat careful negotiation as a threat. Every species this empire has ever absorbed negotiated carefully in its early contact, envoy Vorn, before eventually yielding to the inevitability of Vorthing expansion. I see nothing in your report beyond the ordinary caution of a species, not yet fully aware of its own limitations. Kasia Vorn, who had hoped for rather more serious consideration than her report actually received, pressed the matter as far as court protocol permitted a mid-ranking envoy to press an emperor's declared judgment. Your Majesty, I would ask the court's indulgence to note one further detail before this matter is closed. I requested, as part of my mission's standard preparation, a historical assessment of Terran civilization from our own scholarly division. The assessment I received was considerably more extensive and considerably more unsettling than any comparable report I have received regarding any other newly contacted species in my career. I would recommend this court review that assessment in full before finalizing our long-term policy toward Terran space. Duly noted, Caltorius Ray said, in a tone that closed the matter rather more definitively than his words alone suggested. This court has considerably more pressing concerns than a single envoy's unease about a species our own survey division has already classified as an unremarkable future acquisition. See that the scholarly assessment is filed appropriately. I do not anticipate needing to consult it further. The second warning arrived 7 years later, in the aftermath of a border skirmish that should have, by every prior pattern of Vorthing military engagement, resolved itself as a routine demonstration of imperial authority, rather than the costly, unsettling defeat it actually became. Fleet Commander Desea Korath, tasked with escorting a Vorthing survey team through a disputed region of space adjacent to an expanding Terran colonial frontier, had ordered a limited show of force against a small Terran patrol squadron that her own intelligence assessed as heavily outmatched, intending nothing more than a brief, controlled demonstration of Vorthing military superiority that would, in the ordinary run of such encounters, secure the disputed territory without requiring any serious commitment of imperial resources. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes and cost Desea Korath 4 of her 7 ships, against a Terran patrol squadron that had, according to her own after-action report, responded to the provocation with a speed, precision, and coordinated tactical improvisation that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the unremarkable defensive capability her intelligence briefing had led her to expect. I do not believe this engagement's outcome reflects any failure of my own command judgment, she wrote, in a report she submitted with the particular caution of an officer who understood, all too well, how such reports tended to be received at the Vorthing court. I believe it reflects a systemic underestimation of Terran military capability, that this empire's intelligence services urgently need to revise before further engagements of this kind produce considerably worse outcomes than the one I am regrettably reporting today. The report reached Emperor Caltorius Ray's court through his Minister of Military Affairs, Lord Braxus Thel, who delivered it with rather more editorial caution than Desea Korath's own blunt language had originally contained, having learned, across 11 years of service to the Emperor, exactly how badly unfiltered bad news tended to be received. "A minor border skirmish, Your Majesty," Braxis Thel said, "resulting in the loss of 4 escort vessels against what appears to have been an unusually well-prepared Terran patrol formation. Commander Korath's own conduct has been referred for formal review, given the disproportionate losses relative to the engagement's modest strategic stakes." Kaltorius Ray, now approaching the 11th year of a reign that had, by that point, absorbed 3 additional client systems into the Empire's growing territory through considerably more conventional, one-sided conquests, received the news with an irritation that carried, beneath its surface, the particular defensiveness of a ruler whose civilizational confidence did not easily accommodate contradicting evidence. 4 escort vessels lost to a species this empire has consistently assessed as a modest future acquisition, he said. "I find Commander Korath's own competence considerably more likely an explanation than any genuine Terran military sophistication, Lord Thel. See that her review proceeds accordingly, and ensure our intelligence division revises nothing about our existing Terran assessment on the strength of a single officer's poor tactical judgment." Disia Korath was formally reprimanded within the month, her subsequent career permanently constrained by a black mark that followed her for the remainder of her service, and the Vorthane Empire's official intelligence assessment of Terran military capability remained, in every substantive respect, exactly as it had stood in the report Kasha Vorn had delivered 7 years earlier. A species judged unremarkable, its occasional demonstrations of unexpected capability attributed, again and again, to isolated command failures rather than any pattern worth the court's serious, sustained attention. The third warning, and by far the most thorough of the 3, arrived in the 15th year of Kaltorius Ray's reign, commissioned not by any nervous envoy or defensive fleet commander, but by the Emperor's own chief scholar, an elderly and widely respected historian named Velinar Ask, who had served 3 successive Vorthane emperors, and had built her considerable reputation on a career-long insistence that sound imperial policy required rigorous, unflinching historical analysis rather than convenient assumption. She had spent 2 years compiling, at her own initiative, and with a thoroughness that drew on every archival resource the Empire's scholarly division could provide, a comprehensive assessment of Terran civilization's full recorded history, and she requested, upon its completion, a formal audience with the Emperor to present her findings directly, rather than allowing the report to be filtered, as Kasha Vorn's warning years before had been, through the more cautious editorial instincts of an intermediary minister. "Your Majesty," she said, standing before the court with the particular gravity of a scholar who understood exactly how unwelcome her findings were likely to prove, "I have spent 2 years studying the full historical record of the Terran species, and I have concluded that this empire's continued classification of that species as an unremarkable future acquisition represents the single most significant strategic misjudgment currently shaping Vorthane foreign policy. Their history demonstrates a pattern of resilience, adaptability, and capacity for both destructive and constructive achievement that I have not encountered in 40 years of comparative civilizational study. Among any other species this empire has ever contacted or absorbed. I would recommend, in the strongest possible terms available to this court, that the empire abandon any consideration of eventual Terran conquest and pursue instead a long-term policy of careful, respectful coexistence before the costs of continued underestimation grow considerably higher than this empire can comfortably absorb. Kaltorius Ray, now 46 years old and firmly settled into a reign that had, across 15 years, expanded Vorthane territory by a considerable margin through conquests that had only further reinforced his own certainty regarding the inevitability of his civilizational destiny. Listened to Velenar Ask's presentation with an expression that grew progressively colder as her findings unfolded, and responded, when she finally concluded, with a rebuke considerably sharper than any he had directed at either of the two previous warnings. "You ask this court to abandon 6 centuries of Vorthane destiny," he said, "on the strength of a historian's reading of one species' distant, disorganized past. I have absorbed 41 systems into this empire across 15 years of reign, chief scholar. I have faced, in that time, considerably more capable adversaries than a single, modestly armed frontier species, and I have prevailed against every one of them, exactly as the prophecy that named my destiny at birth promised this empire I would. I find your report considerably more concerning as evidence of your own advancing age and diminishing judgment than as any genuine reflection of Terran capability, and I would suggest, Chief Scholar Ask, that you reconsider whether your continued service to this court remains an asset this empire can afford to retain." Velenar Ask, dismissed from court service within the week despite 4 decades of otherwise distinguished counsel to 3 successive emperors, spent her final years compiling a private, unpublished account of her own dismissal and the historical assessment that had prompted it, a document that would not surface publicly until considerably after the events her warning had tried and failed to prevent, and that historians studying the empire's eventual collapse would come to regard as one of the more prescient and thoroughly ignored strategic assessments in the whole of Vorthane imperial history. The final provocation arrived in the 22nd year of Kaltorius Ray's reign, born not from any single dramatic incident, but from a gradual convergence of pressures that had been building, largely unnoticed by the wider Vorthane public, for the better part of the preceding decade. The empire's rate of expansion had slowed considerably since the ambitious early conquests of Kaltorius Ray's first 15 years, its remaining unclaimed frontier increasingly bordered by powers either too well established to absorb easily, or, in the specific case of the growing Terran sphere of influence, too costly in prior engagements to make further provocation an obviously attractive proposition. Domestic political pressure, meanwhile, had grown steadily more insistent, driven by a restless nobility whose own fortunes had long depended on the steady flow of newly conquered territory and resources that Kaltorius Ray's earlier reign had reliably provided, and who now found themselves, as that flow slowed, increasingly vocal in their private and occasionally public questioning of whether the prophecy that had named their emperor's destiny at birth remained, 22 years into his reign, anywhere near completion. It was in this climate of mounting political pressure that Grand Admiral Vesek Thorn, a considerably younger and considerably more ambitious officer than the cautious fleet commander Korath, whose career the emperor had ended 2 decades earlier, presented Kaltorius Ray with a proposal calculated, with rather more cynical political awareness than any genuine military confidence, to address both the emperor's stalled conquest ambitions and the nobility's restless discontent in a single, decisive stroke, a full military campaign against the growing Terran colonial frontier, framed not as a modest border skirmish but as the definitive, long-overdue completion of the Vorthane ascendance, itself the final conquest that would prove, once and for all, the prophecy's promised destiny had never wavered. "Your Majesty," Vesek Thorn said, presenting his campaign proposal to a court considerably more receptive to bold action than the cautious counsel Velenar Ask had once offered. "This empire possesses, at this moment, the largest standing battle fleet in its 6th-century history, a force this court has spent the last decade building specifically for a campaign of exactly this magnitude. I do not believe the isolated setbacks this empire experienced in prior, limited engagements with Terran forces reflect the true balance of power between our two civilizations. Those engagements involved modest patrol squadrons and border escorts. A full campaign, committing this empire's complete military strength against Terran space, would settle the question definitively, and would provide this court's restless nobility with precisely the kind of decisive, glorious victory that has felt, in recent years, increasingly overdue." Kaltorius Ray, now 63 years old and increasingly conscious, in the private, unguarded moments his public confidence rarely revealed, of a prophecy that remained frustratingly incomplete after 22 years of otherwise successful reign, found in Vesek Thorn's proposal exactly the validation his own accumulated doubts had been quietly seeking. "You propose the campaign this empire's entire history has been building toward," he said. "I have waited 22 years for precisely this moment, Grand Admiral. See that the fleet is prepared. I will not have this empire's destined ascendance delayed a single day longer than absolutely necessary by a species this court has already proven, on 3 separate occasions, does not merit the caution certain advisers once urged upon this throne. No one in the assembled court that day thought to raise, or dared to raise, the memory of Kasha Vorn's dismissed warning, or Disia Korath's punished defeat, or Velenar Ask's discarded historical assessment, though at least 2 of the empire's more senior ministers present in that chamber privately recalled all 3, and privately wondered in the quiet of their own thoughts whether an emperor who had spent 22 years refusing to hear any warning about this particular species was truly prepared for whatever answer his declared campaign was about to receive. The Vorthane Empire's invasion fleet, numbering some 412 warships and representing, by Grand Admiral Vesek Thorn's own proud accounting, the single largest military force the Empire had committed to any campaign in its 6th-century history, crossed into Terran-controlled space 8 months later, and encountered, within the first 72 hours of the campaign, a defense considerably more organized, more technologically sophisticated, and more thoroughly prepared than any prior Vorthing engagement with Terran forces had ever suggested was possible. Terran Unified Command had spent the intervening months, once its own intelligence services confirmed the scale of the Vorthing fleet's mobilization, coordinating a defense that drew on every resource the wider coalition alliance structure Earth had spent decades quietly building, could provide. Allied fleets from a dozen sympathetic powers who had, across years of watching Earth's own patient, understated demonstrations of capability, concluded that a species this consistently underestimated by hostile powers deserved rather more serious support than the Vorthing Empire's own outdated intelligence assessments had ever anticipated any Terran ally extending. Grand Admiral Vesek Thorn's own flagship, the Empire's newest and most heavily armed capital vessel, found itself, within the campaign's opening week, engaged not against the modest, outmatched colonial defense force his own briefing had promised, but against a coordinated, multi-species defensive formation that combined Terran tactical doctrine with the accumulated military technology of half a dozen allied powers, a combination his own fleet's doctrine, built entirely around the assumption of straightforward numerical and technological superiority, had never once been designed to counter. Losses are considerably beyond acceptable parameters, Grand Admiral, his own tactical officer reported, 17 days into a campaign that had, by that point, cost the invasion fleet nearly a third of its original strength against a defense that showed no sign whatsoever of the collapse. Vesek Thorn's confident briefing had assured the Emperor was imminent. I would recommend requesting reinforcement, or considering a strategic withdrawal to reassess the campaign's viability before further losses compromise this fleet's capacity to maintain any organized retreat at all. Vesek Thorn, whose entire career and considerable personal ambition now rested on a campaign he had personally promised his emperor would deliver, are the definitive, glorious conquest that would finally complete a prophecy 22 years overdue, found himself unable to countenance the possibility of withdrawal, and pressed the campaign forward for another 6 weeks with an obstinance that mirrored, in its own smaller way, exactly the same refusal to accept contradicting evidence that had defined his emperor's entire reign. The fleet's losses mounted steadily across those 6 weeks, each new engagement revealing further gaps between Vorthing doctrine and the considerably more adaptive, coordinated defense Earth and its allies had prepared, until the invasion force that had crossed into Terran space 412 ships strong retreated, some 11 weeks after the campaign's confident opening, with barely 130 vessels remaining fit for continued service. And Grand Admiral Vesek Thorn himself among the casualties, his flagship destroyed in the campaign's final, desperate engagement while attempting to cover the retreat of the fleet's remaining survivors. News of the catastrophic defeat reached the Vorthan capital some 3 weeks after the invasion fleet's shattered remnants finally limped back across the Empire's own border, and produced, across the following months, a political crisis considerably more severe than anything Kaltorius Ray's 22 years of otherwise successful reign had ever required him to navigate. The restless nobility whose discontent had originally pushed Grand Admiral Thorne's ambitious campaign proposal toward imperial approval found themselves, in the wake of its catastrophic failure, transformed almost overnight from eager advocates of conquest into the campaign's most vocal critics. Several of the Empire's most powerful noble houses beginning, within weeks of the defeat's confirmation. Private conversations regarding the emperor's continued fitness to hold a throne whose foundational prophecy now appeared, in light of the campaign's disastrous outcome, considerably less assured than 4 decades of careful dynastic mythology had always insisted. Kaltorius Ray, faced with a political crisis he had never once, across 22 years of confident reign, seriously prepared himself to navigate, responded with the same instinct that had defined his response to every prior warning regarding Terran capability. A refusal to accept that the catastrophe reflected any fundamental flaw in his own judgment, and an increasingly desperate search for alternative explanations that might preserve both his own authority and the prophecy that had shaped his entire understanding of his reign's purpose. Grand Admiral Thorne's tactical failures cost this empire a campaign that should have succeeded, he told his remaining court, in an address intended to steady a nobility whose confidence in his rule had begun, for the first time in his reign, to visibly waver. This empire's destiny remains exactly as assured as the prophecy that named it at my birth. We have suffered a setback born of one commander's inadequate execution, not any fundamental weakness in this empire's strength or purpose. I intend to rebuild this fleet, appoint new leadership considerably more capable of the campaign's proper execution, and complete the Vorthan ascendance within this decade, exactly as destiny has always promised. The address, intended to restore confidence, instead accelerated a political unraveling that had already, by the time Kaltorius Ray delivered it, progressed considerably further than his own court advisors had been willing to fully disclose to him. 3 of the Empire's outlying client systems, whose own loyalty had always rested more on the Empire's demonstrated military dominance than any genuine ideological commitment to Vorthan rule, declared formal independence within the month, correctly calculating that an empire which had just lost nearly 3/4 of its largest fleet in living memory possessed neither the military capacity nor the political will to enforce continued submission against a coordinated rebellion. A 4th system, considerably more strategically significant than the first 3, followed within the following season, its own local governor citing, in his formal declaration, the Empire's catastrophic Terran campaign as definitive proof that Vorthan military supremacy, the foundational premise underlying every client system's continued submission across 6 centuries of imperial rule, could no longer be assumed to hold. The rebellion spread across the following 2 years with a momentum that Kaltorius Ray's remaining loyalist forces, already stretched thin by the losses of the failed Terran campaign, found themselves increasingly unable to contain each successive client system's declaration of independence, further eroding the empire's remaining military and economic base, and further emboldening the next system's own calculation that the moment for breaking free of 6 centuries of Vorthen submission had finally, decisively arrived. Lord Braxis Thel, the Emperor's Minister of Military Affairs who had once softened Disia Korath's blunt warning years before delivering it to the throne, found himself, in the crisis's second year, presiding over a military council considerably more concerned with preventing the Empire's outright collapse than with any remaining hope of restoring its former glory. We do not have the fleet strength remaining to reconquer even a fraction of the systems that have already declared independence, he told a considerably diminished and considerably more anxious imperial court, in a briefing that carried none of the careful diplomatic softening his earlier reports had once employed. I would recommend this court begin preparing for the very real possibility that the Vorthane Empire, as it has existed for 6 centuries, may not survive the current crisis in any form its founding dynasty would recognize as a continuation of its original purpose. Caltorius Ray, now 66 years old and visibly diminished by 2 years of accumulating crisis, in a way that struck even his oldest courtiers as a considerably more profound transformation than mere physical aging could account for, found himself, in the private hours between increasingly desperate court sessions, returning often to the memory of 3 warnings he had spent 2 decades refusing to seriously consider. He requested, in the crisis's final months, a search of the imperial archives for Velenar, asks original historical assessment, the report he had dismissed so thoroughly 7 years earlier that he had also dismissed the woman who compiled it, and found, reading through its full contents for the first time in the quiet isolation of his own private chambers, precisely the analysis that might have spared his empire the whole of the catastrophe now unfolding, had he been willing, at any point across the preceding 2 decades, to actually hear it. I did not lack the warnings, he told Braxis Thel, in one of the final private audiences of his reign, the historical assessment open on the table between them. I had 3, delivered by 3 different people across 2 decades, each one more thorough and more carefully reasoned than the last. I dismissed every single one of them, because I could not imagine a version of my own reign in which the destiny I was raised from birth to believe in required me to actually listen to caution, rather than simply command it into irrelevance. I wonder now whether the prophecy that named my birth ever actually promised the conquest I spent 22 years pursuing, or whether I simply chose, across all those years, to hear only the version of it that flattered my own certainty. Braxis Thel, who had served 3 successive Vorthane emperors across a considerably longer career than most of his colleagues at court, offered his sovereign an answer that carried, in its quiet honesty, considerably more weight than any of the careful diplomatic softening he had once applied to Disia Korath's original report. I do not believe any prophecy this empire's oracle circles have ever produced, Your Majesty, promised a destiny that did not also require the wisdom to recognize when that destiny's path required adjustment. I believe this empire's true failure was never the prophecy itself, but the 6 centuries of dynastic tradition that taught every Vorthane emperor before you to treat caution as weakness and warning as insult, rather than as the essential counsel any sovereign genuinely committed to his people's long-term welfare requires to govern wisely. I do not say this to add to your majesty's burden in this empire's darkest hour. I say it because I believe, whatever remains of this empire after the current crisis finally settles, it deserves a foundation considerably more resilient than the one that carried us to this catastrophic reckoning. Kaltorius Rey abdicated the Obsidian throne 8 months later, in a formal ceremony considerably more subdued than the elaborate coronation that had marked his ascension 23 years earlier, transferring imperial authority to his eldest daughter, Princess Ileana Rey, a decision he made, according to the private account he left for her alongside the transition, not out of any external political pressure his diminished authority could no longer resist, but out of a genuine, hard-won conviction that the empire's survival required leadership willing to build its foundation on something considerably more durable than the unexamined certainty that had defined his own catastrophic final years. I leave you an empire considerably smaller and considerably more fragile than the one I inherited, he wrote, in the private letter that accompanied his formal abdication. I do not believe that diminishment is beyond eventual repair, but I believe its repair requires a sovereign willing to do what I spent 22 years refusing to do to actual. Lie here the warnings this empire's most capable advisors offer, rather than simply commanding those warnings into silence, because they arrive inconvenient to whatever certainty currently comforts the throne. I have enclosed, alongside this letter, the full historical assessment Chief Scholar Veliner asked compiled at considerable personal cost to her own career, 7 years before the campaign that ultimately proved every one of her warnings correct. I would ask you to read it not as a historical curiosity, but as the foundational document of whatever wiser relationship this empire eventually builds with the Terran species, and with every other power this empire encounters going forward, whose true capability our own pride has made us too quick to underestimate. Empress Ileana Rey, ascending to a throne she had spent the preceding 2 years watching her father's own catastrophic misjudgment steadily diminish, approached the crisis of her early reign with a caution her father's own dynasty had rarely, across 6 centuries, thought to cultivate in its rulers. She recalled Veliner ask from the modest retirement the elderly scholar had spent 7 years enduring following her dismissal from court, appointing her, in one of the new empress's first formal acts, as the founding director of a newly established Office of Strategic Assessment, tasked specifically with ensuring no future Vorthane sovereign would ever again face a catastrophe of this magnitude without having first received, and genuinely considered, every warning the empire's own intelligence and scholarly resources could provide. I do not know whether this empire can fully recover what my father's reign cost it, Ileana Rey told Veliner ask, during the elderly scholar's first formal audience with the new empress. I know that recovery, whatever shape it eventually takes, cannot be built on the same certainty that produced this crisis in the first place. I would ask you, chief scholar, to tell me plainly, going forward, whatever this throne needs to hear rather than whatever it might prefer to hear. And I promise you, in return, considerably more genuine consideration than the warning you once offered my father ever received. Empress Ileana Ray's first major diplomatic initiative, undertaken within her reign's opening year, sought formal peace terms with the Terran Unified Command, whose defensive victory had precipitated her father's downfall. A negotiation she approached with a candor considerably different from the guarded, superiority-driven posture that had characterized every prior Vorthane diplomatic engagement across the Empire's 6th-century history. I will not pretend in these negotiations that my father's campaign against your species was anything other than a catastrophic misjudgment born of pride this empire's own dynastic tradition should have taught him to guard against considerably more carefully than it did, she told Ambassador Renat Achterberg, the same Terran diplomat whose own career had, some years earlier, included a rather different meeting with a Krivex archivist whose historical research had produced a similarly consequential reassessment of Earth's true capability. I do not ask this negotiation to erase the losses your species suffered defending against an invasion my empire should never have launched. I ask only that we build, from this catastrophe's wreckage, a relationship considerably more honest than the one my father's certainty ever permitted this empire to pursue with any power it encountered. Renat Achterberg, who had, across a long diplomatic career, negotiated with a considerable range of coalition powers and hostile empires alike, found Ileana Ray's directness a welcome, if somewhat unusual, foundation for a peace negotiation that concluded within the following months, on terms considerably more favorable to genuine long-term stability than either side's prior military posturing had ever suggested was achievable. I've negotiated with a fair number of powers who came to the table only after learning, at considerable cost, exactly how badly they'd misjudged this species, Renat told her own staff, following the formal conclusion of the peace accords. I don't think I've encountered many who arrived at that table with quite as much genuine self-awareness about the cost of that misjudgment as Empress Ray brought to this particular negotiation. I find myself rather more optimistic about the Vorthane Empire's long-term prospects under her rule than I would have predicted, given everything her father's reign put both our peoples through to reach this point. The formal peace accords, signed some 14 months after Kaltorius Ray's abdication, established not merely a cessation of hostilities, but a genuine framework for ongoing diplomatic and economic cooperation between the two powers, a relationship that would, across the following decades of Ileana Ray's own considerably longer and considerably more stab. Lorraine, develop into one of the more consequential partnerships in the wider coalition's evolving political landscape, built, as Ileana Ray herself would often note in later years, on the hard, costly lesson her father's 22 years of ignored warnings had ultimately taught an entire empire, at a price considerably higher than any of the three advisors who had originally tried to prevent it would ever have wished to see paid. Desea Korath, whose career had been permanently constrained for 2 decades by the reprimand Kaltorius Ray's court issued following her honest report of an engagement she had not, in fact, mishandled, received formal rehabilitation within the first year of Ileana Ray's reign, the new empress personally reviewing the original after-action report, alongside Velinar Ask's own long-buried historical assessment and concluding, with a directness her father's court had never extended to the matter, that Korath's original warning had been not merely accurate but prophetic in ways. The intervening 2 decades of catastrophe had proven beyond any reasonable dispute. I want it formally entered into this empire's military record, Ileana Ray said, presiding over the ceremony that restored Korath's rank and reputation. That Fleet Commander Korath's conduct during the engagement that ended her career's advancement for 2 decades reflected exactly the kind of clear-eyed tactical honesty this empire's military tradition should have rewarded rather than punished. I cannot restore the 20 years this empire's own institutional pride cost you, Commander, but I can ensure that no future Vorthane officer who delivers an honest, unwelcome report of enemy capability ever again faces the same unjust consequence you endured for telling this court a truth it simply did not wish to hear. Desea Korath, considerably older now, and having spent 2 decades in a diminished posting she had long since made a kind of uneasy peace with, accepted the restoration with an emotion she found herself, even in the formal ceremony's public setting, unable to fully disguise. "I did not expect to see this day, Your Majesty," she said. "I had rather made my peace with the idea that this empire's institutional memory would remember my career only as a footnote to a defeat it never properly examined. I am grateful, more than I can easily express, that your reign has chosen to remember it rather more honestly than that." Kasha Vorn, the trade envoy whose original warning had opened the entire chain of ignored counsel some 3 decades earlier, had retired from active diplomatic service by the time Ileana Ray's reforms reached far enough back to formally acknowledge her own long-dismissed report. But she attended the small, private ceremony the new empress arranged in her honor with a satisfaction that carried, in her own account of the day, considerably more relief than triumph. "I spent 30 years wondering whether I had simply misjudged an ordinary negotiation as something more significant than it actually was," she told the gathered assembly, in remarks considerably shorter and more measured than the formal weight of the occasion might have suggested she deliver. "I am glad, if nothing else, to finally know that my own judgment was sound, even if it took this empire considerably longer, and considerably more cost, than I would ever have wished, to reach the same conclusion I offered a young emperor 30 years ago in a court that had no particular interest in hearing it." Kaltorius Ray spent the years following his abdication in a modest retirement estate on the outskirts of the Vorthane capital, considerably removed from the political influence he had once wielded so absolutely, and devoted a significant portion of those final years to a project his own advisors found, in light of everything his reign had cost the empire, one of the more unexpectedly fitting conclusions to his story. A personal, unflinching memoir documenting, in considerable detail, every warning he had received and dismissed across 22 years of reign, intended not for publication or public rehabilitation, but as a private instructional document he requested be preserved specifically for the education of future Vorthane heirs. I do not write this account to seek forgiveness for what my pride cost this empire, he wrote, in the memoir's opening passage. I do not believe such forgiveness is mine to request, given the scale of what my 2 decades of refused counsel ultimately cost both my own people and the Terran species my ambition so badly misjudged. I write this account because I believe the specific, repeated pattern of my failure, 3 separate warnings, delivered by 3 considerably more perceptive advisors than I ever gave them credit for being, each dismissed not through any careful, reasoned counterargument, but through the simple, reflexive certainty that my own destiny placed me beyond the need to seriously cons. Either contradicting evidence deserves to be studied in precise, uncomfortable detail by whatever sovereign eventually inherits the responsibility I so badly failed to discharge. I would ask that future heirs to this throne read this account not as history, but as warning, in the hope that some future Vorthane sovereign proves considerably wiser than I ever managed to be. He requested, in the memoir's final year of composition, a private audience with Velenar Ask, the scholar whose career he had ended over a report that had, in the years since, proven entirely accurate, and the 2 of them met in the modest garden of his retirement estate for a conversation that neither had expected, across the considerable bitterness the intervening years might reasonably have produced, to find as genuinely reconciling as it ultimately became. I owe you an apology I suspect no formal ceremony could ever adequately deliver, Caltorius Ray told her, in what would prove one of the final, significant conversations of his life. You gave this empire its clearest possible warning, at considerable personal cost, and I answered it by ending a 4-decade career built on exactly the kind of rigorous, honest counsel this throne desperately needed and simply refused to hear. I do not know how to properly account for what that refusal ultimately cost, Chief Scholar, beyond telling you as plainly as I am able that you were right, and I was catastrophically, inexcusably wrong. Velenar Ask, who had spent the years since her dismissal watching her own warning play out in exactly the catastrophic detail she had once tried to prevent, found in the old emperor's unguarded admission something she had not expected to feel after so many years of quiet, bitter vindication. I did not come here today seeking an apology, Your Majesty, she said. I came because I believe an empire's future is better served by understanding exactly how its past mistakes were made, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I believe you understand that lesson now considerably more thoroughly than any formal apology could ever demonstrate on its own. I would ask only that the memoir you're compiling receive the honest, unflinching treatment your reign's final years suggest you're finally prepared to give it. That, I think, would honor the warning considerably better than any apology this garden conversation could offer. Word of the Vorthane Empire's catastrophic Terran campaign, and the political collapse that followed it spread through the wider coalition's diplomatic circles with the particular speed reserved for cautionary tales that confirmed a pattern several other established powers had, by that point, already begun independently recognizing in their own dealings with humanity. It reached, within months of the campaign's disastrous conclusion, a considerable number of governments who had themselves spent years operating on classifications and assumptions about Terran capability, considerably closer to the Vorthane Empire's original, dismissive assessment than any of them found entirely comfortable to acknowledge in the aftermath. Counselor Aveline Torsk of the Meridian Compact, addressing a closed session of the Coalition's broader diplomatic assembly some months after the Vorthane collapse became public knowledge, offered an assessment that several of her colleagues would later describe as one of the more sobering addresses the assembly had received in recent memory. The Vorthane Empire is not the first power to catastrophically misjudge this particular species, she said, and I do not believe, based on the pattern this assembly has now observed across a considerable number of separate incidents, that it will be the last, unless this coalition's member governments take rather more seriously the specific lesson each of these incidents keeps teaching us. A fleet hidden for 40 years at Sol, a sentinel vessel mistaken for derelict wreckage at Kess Hollow, a warship's crew that refused to accept its own reported death and captured an enemy patrol vessel deep in hostile territory rather than simply perishing as expected. An entire dominion forced into emergency reclassification after a single archivist's historical research revealed a pattern its own military doctrine had overlooked for 4,000 years. And now an empire that ignored 3 separate warnings across 2 decades launched the largest invasion fleet in its 6th-century history against a species it had consistently underestimated, and watched that same empire fracture and very nearly collapse entirely in the aftermath of the campaign's catastrophic failure. I would ask this assembly at some point to stop treating each new example as an isolated anomaly and start recognizing it as the single most consistent, most costly diplomatic and military lesson this coalition has learned in the whole of its recorded history, that humanity's quiet, unassuming presentation has never once been an accurate measure of what actually stands behind it, and every power that has tested that assumption the hard way has paid a price considerably higher than the modest caution, actually reading their own intelligence more carefully would ever have required. The address drew no immediate, formal policy response from the assembled coalition membership, precisely the kind of institutional inertia that had, across each of the incidents Counselor Torsk cited, initially delayed the specific reckoning that eventually followed. But it circulated, in the months afterward, through a considerable number of diplomatic and intelligence services across the wider coalition, prompting, in more than one government's own internal review, the same quiet, uncomfortable reassessment that had, by that point, become an increasingly familiar pattern among any power whose own historical dealings with Earth had rested on assumptions considerably less careful than the species itself had ever actually deserved. Empress Ileana Ray's reign, across the 2 decades that followed her father's abdication, rebuilt the Vorthan Empire into a considerably smaller but considerably more stable power than the sprawling 6th century dynasty that had once pursued an unquestioned civilizational destiny across the whole of its known galaxy. Its remaining territory secured not through the reflexive military expansion that had defined every prior Vorthan reign, but through a genuine, carefully cultivated network of diplomatic and economic partnerships that her father's own generation would have dismissed, without a second thought, as an unworthy substitute for outright conquest. The Office of Strategic Assessment that Velenar Ask founded in the crisis's immediate aftermath grew, across Ileana Ray's reign, into one of the Empire's most consequential institutions, its formal charter requiring, for the first time in Vorthan imperial history, that any proposed military campaign against a power the office assessed as carrying significant hidden capability receive a mandatory, unfiltered hearing before the throne, delivered by the office's own director, without the editorial softening that had once transformed Disia Korath's blunt original warning into Braxis Thell's considerably gentler summary. It was an institutional safeguard that would, across the following decades, prevent at least two further potential conflicts the office's own analysts assessed as carrying the same catastrophic risk profile that had once destroyed nearly the whole of Kaltorius Ray's inherited empire. Each averted crisis quietly validating, in its own modest way, the hard, costly lesson the Vorthan dynasty had finally, if belatedly, learned to institutionalize rather than simply regret. Kaltorius Ray died 11 years into his daughter's reign, having spent his final decade in a quiet, largely private retirement considerably removed from the political influence and civilizational certainty that had once defined the whole of his identity, and requested, in his final testament, that his memoir be formally incorporated into the same officer training curriculum the Office of Strategic Assessment had developed for exactly the purpose he had originally intended it to serve. I spent 22 years believing that my own certainty was itself a kind of strength. The memoir's closing passage read, composed in the final months of its author's life. I have come to believe, across the considerably more difficult years that followed my reign's catastrophic final campaign, that certainty untested by genuine counsel is not strength at all, but simply pride wearing strength's borrowed clothing, and that the true measure of a sovereign's wisdom lies not in how confidently he commands, but in how carefully he listens, particularly to the counsel he would most prefer not to hear. I was warned 3 times across 2 decades by 3 people considerably wiser and considerably more perceptive than I gave any of them credit for being at the time. I dismissed every one of them, and my empire paid a price for that dismissal considerably higher than any of us could have imagined when Kasha Vorn first stood before my court, a young emperor barely 4 years into his reign, and asked me, as plainly and honestly as her own considerable courage allowed, to simply listen. Velenar Ask, who outlived Kaltorius Ray by nearly a decade, and continued serving as an occasional advisor to the Office of Strategic Assessment well into her 90s, delivered a considerable number of lectures across those final years to new generations of Vorthan officers and administrators, each one built around the same central case study that had, by that point, become required study across the whole of the empire's military and diplomatic training curriculum. The specific, documented pattern of 3 ignored warnings and the catastrophic campaign that followed their dismissal. I do not teach this history to condemn Emperor Caltorius Ray's memory, she told one such gathering, some years before her own death, addressing a class of young Vorthan cadets who had grown up in an empire considerably more cautious and considerably more willing to listen than the one that had shaped her own long career. I teach it because I believe every one of you will, at some point in your own careers, find yourself standing where Kasha Vorn once stood, or Disia Korath, or I myself did, delivering counsel your own superiors may find inconvenient, unwelcome, or simply too costly to the comfortable certainties they'd prefer to maintain. I would ask each of you to remember, when that moment arrives, that the true failure in this empire's history was never really the 3 of us who tried to warn a sovereign what our own careful research and hard-won experience had revealed. It was a court and a dynastic tradition that had spent 6 centuries teaching its rulers to treat honest counsel as insult rather than as the essential gift any wise sovereign requires to govern well. I hope whatever role each of you eventually occupies in this empire's future, that you help build and preserve a tradition considerably wiser than the one that cost this empire so dearly to finally learn. She kept, in the modest office, the Office of Strategic Assessment maintained for her well into her final years, a single framed document that visitors to her office often asked about, and that she was, by all accounts, always glad to explain. A copy of her own original historical assessment of Terran civilization, the report that had ended her 4-decade court career in a single dismissive audience, now preserved as the founding document of the very institution her dismissal had, indirectly and at considerable cost, eventually made necessary. I spent 7 years believing that report was the greatest professional failure of my career, she told a visiting historian, some years before her death, who had come to interview her for a formal chronicle of the Vorthan Empire's tumultuous transition between Caltorius Ray's catastrophic reign and his daughter's considerably wiser one. I have come to understand across the years since that it was in fact the single most important thing I ever wrote, precisely because it was ignored. A warning heeded prevents its own vindication. A warning ignored and then proven catastrophically correct becomes something considerably more powerful, not merely advice, but evidence, and evidence, I have found, tends to teach lessons that mere counsel alone rarely manages to instill as thoroughly, however much higher the price of learning it that way inevitably turns out to be. Ambassador Renat Terburg, reflecting some years later on the whole of the Vorthan affair during a retrospective address to Earth's own diplomatic corps, offered a closing assessment that captured, in her own characteristically measured way, the particular shape of the lesson an entire generation of coalition powers had, by that point, been forced to learn through one costly demonstration after another. I do not think humanity set out to teach the wider galaxy this particular lesson, she told the assembled diplomats, in remarks that would, in the years that followed, be quoted often alongside similar reflections offered by officials across a considerable range of the incidents that had, each in their own way, reinforced the same underlying pattern. We did not build a hidden fleet at Saul, or maintain a sentinel watch at Kess Hollow, or survive 4 months adrift in enemy territory, or compile an honest historical record any archivist might eventually read, specifically to humble empires who underestimated us. We simply did what our own history and our own hard-won caution taught us was necessary to survive and to build something worth building, and left the rest of the galaxy to draw whatever conclusions it eventually drew from watching us do it. I find, looking back on the Vorthane Empire's particular catastrophe, that the saddest part of the whole affair was never really the battle itself, or even the political collapse that followed it. It was watching an emperor spend 22 years surrounded by people who tried, honestly and at considerable personal cost, to tell him the truth, and choosing, every single time, to hear only the version of reality that flattered his own certainty instead. I would hope, whatever lessons this coalition eventually takes from the whole affair, that the most important one has less to do with humanity specifically, and rather more to do with the simple, durable wisdom of actually listening to the people brave enough to tell you what you'd rather not hear. Empress Ileana Ray, presiding over a Vorthane empire that had, by the third decade of her own considerably longer and considerably wiser reign, rebuilt itself into one of the more stable and genuinely respected powers in the wider coalition's evolving political landscape. Kept her father's memoir on permanent display in the same imperial archive that had once housed, unread and largely forgotten, Velinar Ask's original dismissed report, and required, as one of the more unusual traditions of her own reign, that every newly appointed Vorthane minister read both documents in full before taking their formal oath of office. My father's empire fell not because it lacked warning, she told each new generation of ministers, in the same brief address she delivered at every such ceremony across her long reign, but because it had built, across 6 centuries of unbroken success, a tradition that mistook confidence for wisdom, and treated every voice brave enough to question that confidence as an obstacle to destiny, rather than the very thing destiny actually required to be realized safely. I would ask each of you, whatever counsel you eventually find yourselves called upon to give this throne, to remember that an empire's true strength was never its certainty. It is its willingness, even in the height of its own confidence, to keep listening for exactly the warning my father spent 22 catastrophic years refusing to hear.